Welcome back, everybody, to the OPT Network. This morning, we're talking about a subject that we all really need to drill down a little bit better and a little bit more so we can understand diversity, racism, and systematic racism and what that means. But this morning, we're talking about something that you may have heard and just sort of passed it by: microaggressions, what that means and how it relates to each and every one of us. Talking about that this morning is Dr. Michael Baran. He and his co-author have written a book entitled Subtle Acts of Exclusion: How to Understand, Identify, and Stop Microaggressions. Dr. Baran, good morning and welcome.
Good morning, Carlette. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. This is a really complex and simple all at the same time subject. But first of all, tell us about your work as a social scientist.
Yeah, so my training is as a cultural anthropologist and a cognitive psychologist. I started getting called into the field of diversity, equity, and inclusion a long time ago, and really wanted to understand before I started advising other people what they should do about it. I really wanted to understand it first. So I went and got my doctorate in those subjects to really understand, what is this thing called unconscious bias? Why do we still have it? How are we still having these vast disparities and inequities? How are cultures subtly and not so subtly including some people and excluding other people? So that was really what I studied. Finished up my studies, did some teaching for a while at Harvard, then worked doing some practical research at the Frameworks Institute and the American Institutes for Research, and then have been working for a long time now as a practicing diversity, equity, and inclusion expert, where I work with organizations, either corporate, education, government, nonprofit, and work with them on their diversity, inclusion, and equity efforts to really improve the way they work.
So I thought it interesting in the book that so that you could be so true to the work that you decided you wanted to set yourself apart from what you knew and what was
Mhm.
comfortable and what you had learned all these years to really try to figure it out. Tell us about it.
Yeah, that's part of the training of becoming a cultural anthropologist, right? The idea that culture for us, it's not the stuff you just see in museums, right? It's our what we call cultural common sense, the way we understand everything about the world and how it works. And so if you really want to understand that, you kind of got to get outside of your own culture for a while. And so the way cultural anthropologists do that is they do that for a long while. You go live somewhere else in a culture that is not familiar to you, not for a week, not for a month, but for a long time. So I lived in Northeast Brazil in Bahia State for almost 2 years, where you don't know anything about how anything works, and you've got to kind of start from scratch without your own assumptions, without your ways of understanding the world. And you've got to really listen to people and how the world works from their perspective. And just doing that allows you to get this objective understanding of culture. So then when you come home after 2 years, you think you're going home to what you know, so familiar to you, and yet that's when you get culture shock, when all those things you expected to be familiar feel distant and strange, and you almost have this outside perspective on them. Then you can really understand the way culture and communication work in a whole different way.
So when you come back after living in a culture that is something that you could have never known unless you lived in that culture, you come
Mhm.
back to the culture that you think you know and understand. What do you know now that at that time that you had no clue about before?
That's such a great question. Um, so, part of it, one of the things that it really opened my eyes to were just the very subtle messages about race and racism and other aspects of identity that are all around us constantly, right? So, if you think about, for example, children developing these days, children growing up, we tend to have this idea that, oh, well, if adults teach them racism, they'll be racist. If adults teach them bias, they'll have bias. And if we don't, they won't. And that couldn't be further from the truth. Because what we know now is that their brains are seeking out information about race and other aspects of identity from the cultural messages around them. And those messages can be very subtle. So it might not be an adult saying like, well, I don't think gay people should get married, right? It might not be that. It might be a pause that's a little longer than usual when when a man is talking about a past boyfriend or something. It just might be that, okay, right? But in that pause, their brains learn, oh, this is different. This isn't normal, right? And it's all those subtle messages that you can really start to see and that we have to address if we really want to get to a better place, right? Not just where we're free from the explicit racism, but if we really want to get to a place where everyone is included and valued and respected and considered good in the same way.
Sure. So, when you approach this project with your co author, Dr. Tiffany Jana, who is a Black woman, tell us about how the relationship comes into focus and how you guys decide that you will do this work together.
Yeah, another great question. And I'll start out by just explaining that Tiffany identifies as non-binary using them pronouns. So I use they, them pronouns when I refer to
Okay, and
Tiffany.
tell us for people who don't know what non binary means.
Yeah, so it means that Tiffany doesn't identify, for most of their life, they identified as female, and now they don't identify as either strictly male or female, but rather gender non-conforming. So they use they, them pronouns, or sometimes she, her pronouns. So that's what I'll use when I talk about them.
Okay.
So, microaggressions is this topic, as you mentioned, that's so serious. And what the research was showing is that these microaggressions, they kept happening really often to people with terrible consequences, right? Making people feel not satisfied in their jobs, not engaged in the learning, if we're talking about schools, mental and physical health problems when these happen so frequently. And yet we weren't making much progress. And one of the things I would notice when I would do workshops on microaggressions is some reactions that were not productive. First, I'd get some people saying, well, that person called the Black man articulate, but we can't call it a microaggression if we don't know that he was intending to be aggressive, right? We don't know what they were intending. And so you'd get this serious defensiveness that was very unproductive. Then you get people who've been experiencing these microaggressions feeling like, well, they didn't feel very micro to me when they were happening. They felt like a huge deal. And noticed people saying, well, if they're so micro, why are we spending all this time talking about them? So what we started to notice is that term was actually getting in the way of us doing good work. And so I'd start to grumble about, well, like, someone really needs to think of a new term and a new way of addressing this. And I had known Tiffany for a while. And so when Tiffany and I started talking about this, they were like, yeah, I'm finding the same thing. And so we just got together and said, hey, this is a topic that needs a reconceptualization. Let's get together and do that. Obviously, we have different life experiences. As a white man, I'm not experiencing these microaggressions in the same way that Tiffany is, as someone who is Black and gender non-conforming and LGBTQ plus. So we took our life experiences, but then we took the diversity of our professional backgrounds and the commonalities that we shared doing diversity, equity, and inclusion work, looking at all the stories we've heard from people over our years of work. I went out and did 100 interviews with people on the street with a videographer, asking them, what are the subtle things you experience at work that make you feel excluded? So we took all of that research and stories about microaggressions and used it to inform the way we reconceptualize this and really reach people in a new way.
It is a powerful book. And this is an important conversation. You got to stay on point. Our guest this morning is Dr. Michael Baran. The book is Subtle Acts of Exclusion: How to Understand, Identify, and Stop Microaggressions. Stay on point. We're back right after this. Welcome back, everybody, to the OPT Network. This morning, we're talking about how we can understand microaggressions, how we can better understand diversity and systematic racism, and all of the terms that you hear tossed around all the time with maybe not enough information to really understand it. So our guest this morning is Dr. Michael Baran. And he has done incredible work, has an incredible body of work. Now, before we went to break, Dr. Baran, you were talking about those microaggressions. And one of the things that you said, and it's very common, when a white person says to a black person, and you gave the example of a black man, and the white person says, he's very articulate. Why then is that considered to be a microaggression?
Yeah. Well, first, just I'll flag that what Tiffany and I are recommending is that we refer to these as subtle acts of exclusion,
Okay.
because we don't right? If we say it's a microaggression, that's focusing people's attention on the intention as aggressive.
Okay.
And we know,
Good.
like you were saying earlier, it might not be that person's intention to be aggressive. They might be just trying to compliment, right? And yet, right?
Okay, well, let
And
me
yet,
stop you there. Okay, so micro being small, aggression being big. Okay, so we take that out of the way. Subtle acts of exclusion. Why would that be a subtle act of exclusion?
yes, right. So first, because the person might be trying to compliment. So on the surface, they're saying you're so articulate, or some other ones we've heard, you're so well spoken, you're so professional, right? On the surface, it looks like a compliment and maybe feels like you're giving a compliment. Underneath the surface, though, what's being implicitly communicated? You're actually inadequate, or people like you are inadequate because I didn't expect you to be articulate. I didn't expect you to be professional. I didn't expect you to be well spoken. So I'm surprised, pleasantly surprised, right? And so we have to look at what we look at in these subtle acts of exclusion are, one thing is on the surface, but what's being implicitly communicated? Is it you're not normal, you're inadequate, you don't belong, you're invisible, you're a threat, you're a burden, you're a curiosity. All of these things are getting communicated to people under the surface. Like
So
when someone asks,
though, Dr. Baran, is that a lot to ask a person who really, in their own mind, the white person that may have said this about a black person, is that asking that white person to go way, way deep within themselves? Just and they're saying, well, I don't get it. I was just complimenting that person. Do people
right,
have the bandwidth to go that deep to say, because that person was black, or I made it I had an impression about who I thought they were, and when they were really articulate and very well put together, that impressed me. I mean, is that asking too much?
no, it's not asking too much, for so many reasons. I mean, first, I think white people need to go that deep and
Okay.
examine their own biases that sometimes might be unconscious. That's really important. And also, what we're not saying, we are not suggesting that everyone needs to know beforehand what all these subtle acts of exclusion might be for everyone else in the world. We're not saying that. You can't know, right? You don't maybe have the experience or the familiarity with everyone who's different from you. And so you just might not know. What we're asking people to do, though, is, and we give guidelines for how to do this.
Right.
If someone says, "Oh, you were so articulate," and someone else says, "You know what? When people say that, it makes me feel like you're surprised or something. It doesn't make me feel great." What we are asking that white person to then do is, instead of getting defensive and saying, but I was just trying to compliment, but instead of that, them just saying, "Oh, okay, that makes you feel bad. I won't say that." right? And so we're asking white people to be able to take that feedback and to use it to do some self exploration, to do some behavior change in the way they talk to people. If you get that feedback, to really think about it and just do things differently without making a huge deal about it.
Sure. Now, on the other side of that coin, for Black people, and just for this example, we're using Black people, for the Black people who are very articulate and they get that response from white people, that subtle act of exclusion. What about on the other side of the coin when that same Black person is articulate and another Black person says to them, "You sound white"?
Yeah, so these subtle acts of exclusion play out in so many different ways, right? And and it's so complicated. There's no simple way of saying like, well, this is a subtle act of exclusion and this is not. And it's so complex because, for example, what might feel like a subtle act of exclusion one day doesn't feel like it the next. Partly it depends on what's going on with me that day, right? Or what might feel like a subtle act of exclusion from one person doesn't feel like a subtle act of exclusion when a different person says it to me because of the relationship that we have.
Hmm.
Or what feels like a subtle act of exclusion to one person who is Black or who's gay or who's, blind, might not feel like a subtle act of exclusion to a different person who's blind or gay, right?
Right.
Um, so it's all very complex. And the goal is, like I was saying, not that we know everything that's going to feel bad to everyone, not that we walk on eggshells, but rather that we build up cultures in our places of work, our places of learning, the places where we live, where we can just have more open, transparent, honest conversations about these things and just listen to the impact that our words and actions have on other people, take that seriously, and just do things differently to respect everyone.
Right. And that's just what I was thinking. And I'm sure people who are listening and watching might be thinking the same things. I feel like I'm walking on eggshells because I don't know what is correct to say, what could be accepted or taken as a subtle act of exclusion. And so
Mhm.
in the book, you all write about when those acts happen, ways to approach them and ways to open it up so that everybody has an understanding of what that feels like, what it looks like, and what it sounds like. I want to take a break here, but when we come back, I want to talk about how to open that up so that it's not offensive or creates friction, especially in the workplace or the learning place or wherever you may be. But I also want to talk about how those acts of exclusion, how they factor into the system that we are now talking about, which has cultivated racism and sometimes very subtly. Our guest this morning is Dr. Michael Baran, and we're talking about their new book, Subtle Acts of Exclusion: How to Understand, Identify, and Stop Microaggressions. Stay on point. We're back with more after this. Welcome back, everybody, to the OPT Network. You know, one of the things that we really want to do with this forum is we want to create a place and a space where we can talk about anything, and we can do it in a way that makes sense, hopefully, and a way that we can all learn and get better. This morning, our guest is Dr. Michael Baran, and we're talking about subtle acts of exclusion and how we can exclude people without even knowing it. And during the break, I was telling Dr. Barron, we're all guilty of it, not just white people or, Asian people. We've all done it not knowing. For instance, if you say to somebody, she's very exotic, and you all write about this in the book, she's very exotic. And to the person who's giving that compliment, it feels like you're saying that person is very beautiful. But it really is a subtle act of exclusion. Tell us why.
Yeah, I mean, just imagine, the person saying that, it might be the only time they've said something like that in that month, right? So it's not
In that
weighing very
month.
Well, it's not weighing very
Right,
heavy on their minds, right? But if you're someone that is just hearing that again and again and again from everybody, like
right,
you're so exotic, or where are you from, or
right.
what are you, right? If you're hearing that again and again and again, it's just giving you those messages of, you're a curiosity, or you're not normal, or you don't belong. And it is the opposite of inclusion. It's making you not feel included in the place where you work or the place where you live. And that is really a problem, right? It's a problem for you and your happiness, but also your mental health and even your physical health. Research shows when these keep happening to people, it's affecting your physical health. So it's a serious problem we need to do something about.
Who knew it affects their physical health?
hmm Yeah, and you're absolutely right that we all are going to say these things inadvertently. We have stories in the book about examples that we've done, and we're
Right.
diversity, equity, and inclusion professionals. We do this for a living, and we still make mistakes like this. And so the goal isn't to feel like you have to walk on eggshells and get everything perfect all the time. The goal is to feel like I'm committed to fumbling and stumbling through this together with you as we collectively decide we're not going to tolerate these subtle acts of
Mhm.
exclusion, and we're going to talk about them, and we're going to be better.
Have we become hypersensitive in these sort of very subtleties that most people don't even know that they are a problem? Have we become a nation that is hypersensitive?
I don't think we've become too sensitive. Honestly, I think we're maybe just now grappling with the very explicit and systematic inequity, violence, racism. We've never really grappled with that, in our whole history. And I would argue we've never really grappled with these subtle examples or unconscious examples either. And so we've got to really do it if we want a paradigm shift, if we want
Absolutely.
to get to that place we all dream about.
And so because they are so subtle and they lie below or beneath the surface, that's really how the system of systematic racism really evolved, don't you think?
Well, I think a lot of what lies under the surface, yeah, it perpetuates, it provides that foundation for the more explicit violence and words and actions that happen. It provides that foundation that they rest on. And so we've really got to break up that foundation of even the more subtle and unconscious things, too, if we want to address the very visible things that we see.
And so in your work, I want you to define for people who have heard the term systematic racism, and you can really use sort of contextual clues to figure out what that is. But tell us from the scientific view and research, explain to us what it really is.
hmm Yeah. So when you think about disparities, when people talk about racial disparities, right, that just means a difference in average outcomes. So we wouldn't expect that we all have the same wealth, right, on an individual basis. For example, we have different talents, different skills, different professions are paid more, right? We wouldn't expect that we all make exactly the same income or that we have the same wealth. But we wouldn't necessarily expect either that on average, white families would have maybe up to 13 or even more times more wealth than Black families, right? That, when you have those group differences, that is happening because of specific policies, procedures, and practices that are embedded into laws and into institutions, right? That has created those differences. And then those all snowball. So when you have that vast disparity in wealth, then that affects, for example, home values and the health of homes, which homes have mold and which homes don't. The property values affect the schools and how they get funded. It all builds together. And so it creates disparities in all of those issues. And if we just stop and say, oh, now we're going to create race neutral policies, race isn't going to affect anything, then those disparities that are already there, they just get perpetuated. And we have the status quo, which is not where we want to be. This is why Dr. Ibram X. Kendi and others suggest we need anti-racist policies. We need policies that specifically address the disparities that have existed and create more equity among racial groups.
And what about those people, Dr. Baran, that still hold out that systemic racism doesn't exist? And why is it so hard for each side to come together and talk about this subject? One group says, no, we've come a long, long way, and racism hasn't been baked in the cake.
Right.
It's not systemic at all. And then you have the other group here that says, yeah, for more than 400 years, there has been disparity and parity.
Yeah. Yeah. And those groups don't, they don't just break down along racial lines, right?
Right.
Sometimes, the evidence is overwhelming. If you look at all the, historical, social, scientific evidence that's out there about these systemic inequalities, it's overwhelming. There's no denying that it's actually there, right? And sometimes people just don't know, right? And they're open to hearing about it and learning about it. And sometimes there's a more willful denial of it because they don't want to think that the world is like that. And sometimes people are, deliberately being manipulated by people in power, by media organizations to not see those things.
Mm.
And so there's a lot going on in terms of why some people have those conflicts. Like, no, it's totally systemic, or no, it's all your individual effort and you just have to pull yourself up by your bootstraps and try harder, right? And we really need people to understand that, of course, individual effort matters. Of course, individual talent matters. And it's all happening against the backdrop of these systemic inequalities that have been happening.
Absolutely. Let's get a break here. But when we come back, I want to tell people how they can get your book and how they can connect to the work that you are continuing to do. Stay on point. We're back with more right after this. Welcome back, everybody, to the OPT Network. Our guest this morning is Dr. Michael Baran. We're talking about his book entitled Subtle Acts of Exclusion: How to Understand, Identify, and Stop Microaggressions. And it's really, on its face, Dr. Baran, it's a big task. And during the break, we were talking about, again, I go back to what I believe that people are saying. The world is just getting too hypersensitive. And I was posing the question, do you think that people are just too stubborn, in denial? Just what is it that is going to bring people into the ideology that all of these things matter?
Yeah, it's such a great question. I mean, part of it, I think, is that part of it is just we need to change our definition of what racism even is, right? At a foundational level. We've had this idea that racism is one person intentionally doing something violent or bad or mean to another individual person. And so that has allowed people to say, well, that's a racist, but I'm not a racist,
Right.
and really defend their good character and their good intentions. And we need to shift that definition to something more systemic rather than picking out individual bad apples, so to speak. And in fact, actually, Merriam-Webster is changing their definition in the dictionary to reflect that. I love the story. A woman from, I think it was Mississippi, 22-year-old woman, wrote them a note and said, hey, your definition of racism is outdated. It should be this. And they said, oh, you're absolutely right. We're going to change that. So that's part of it. I think when people hear then these, oh, when you said that, maybe it didn't have the effect that you thought it did. It made someone feel excluded. Then people's first reaction is defending themselves, denying that that's even true, right? Filtering it through their own experiences. Well, I wouldn't have thought that. Well, I wouldn't have, experienced it that way. So we need to get people first to just understand how to be able to listen for real, to listen to other people's experiences, to understand the impact it had on them from their perspective and not from our own perspective, not
Right,
jumping into debate, playing devil's advocate.
right.
We don't need that. We need to just listen better.
hmm And I think that's an important point. You, as a white man, and my family, as a black family, husband and wife, who have a 21-year-old son, our conversations with our African American son are quite different from the conversations that you would have with your children. And if we could
Hmm.
just be sensitive to our experiences are different, very vastly different, and we can just hear each other. But by the same token, I don't think that using one race to say that one race is the perpetrator of these subtle acts of exclusion when we're all guilty of them in some way or another, and we just don't think a thing of it until we are the recipients of it.
Yeah,
I had a college
exactly.
professor one time that said to me, I don't think you have what it takes to make it in television. I think you should lean toward radio. You just
Mm,
don't have the look. And what he was suggesting was that I didn't look white enough. And this was, of course, in the early 80s, where there weren't very, very few black women on television. And
right.
so I mean, it offended me. It hurt me
Mhm,
as a young college student, but I don't
mhm.
think that that was his intention. I think that that's just what he thought. I mean, as a full grown woman, I understand that, but as a young woman, I didn't.
Right. Well, and luckily it didn't, but that really could have affected your career and the choices that you made. I mean, it could have had a huge impact on your life, not just offending you, right, in the moment, but really affecting the outcomes of your life.
Right, and
And
it does make you look at, is he right? The evidence says that there aren't very many people who look like me, on television. And he said, you have a really good voice. I think you could do well in radio, but not in television. But by the same token, I'm sure that I have, in turn, created subtle acts of exclusions to people as well. And so
yeah.
I think that there has to be a lot of grace, and you guys talk about that in the book,
Mhm.
so that we can start to have this conversation and give each other the grace that we need to not say, I understand your lot in life or your plight, but to just be heard. Just
Mhm.
people just want to be heard.
Absolutely. Absolutely. To have that openness, that transparency, the true listening, feeling heard, and accountability for really, doing things different and
hmm
better. We all need that, not just like a moment of inspiration. Oh, yeah, I get it. But really, digging deep and changing the way you think about people and the way you act in the world.
Sure. So when you and Dr. Jana launched the book March 10th, the world went into, my goodness, a place
Hmm.
that most of us in our lifetimes could have never imagined. And there was the pandemic, and then there was the death of George Floyd. And I mean, the world literally just, it changed. It became hyper aware that we have some issues. Talk about how the work that you all have been doing for years
Hmm.
now takes center stage.
Yeah, well, like you said, this isn't a new issue,
No.
right? Even these murders that we see, that's not new. But for many, the awareness is new, and the conversations we're having is new, and people trying to learn more, to talk more, to build up those muscles for having these conversations. We work with organizations, and so organizations really diving into, okay, we need to do things better here in terms of equity and inclusion for everyone at the organization. And luckily it seems like they really mean it. At least the
hmm
ones that we're working with really mean it and are rolling up their sleeves and doing the work that needs to get done. right? To commit to it and to follow through then. And that's just what we keep hoping, that this is not performative but
Right.
transformative, right? That the commitment stays and doesn't fade.
Indeed. Before we've got to go, Dr. Baran, tell people how they can connect with you and Dr. Jana on the book, how they can get the book, Subtle Acts of Exclusion, How to Understand, Identify, and Stop Microaggressions.
Yeah, so the book is sold everywhere. Books are sold, Amazon and all the other places, your local bookstores as well. The information on the book you can get by going to subtleactsofexclusion.com. That has information on the book, on me, on Tiffany. And then we love the connection on all the different social media platforms as well. You can find us pretty easily on those places.
There you go. Still so much more to talk about, Dr. Baran, but we want to thank you and your co-author for doing the work and helping us all to think a little bit deeper and be more conscious about who we are and how we present and how we show up in life and how we bring others in or draw others away with the way that we identify with who they are. It is such a critically important conversation.
Yeah, well, thank you, Carlette. It's been a pleasure and a great conversation. So thank you.
Indeed, thank you too. Stay on point, everybody. We're back right after this.